Social, that's the word I was looking for. As if it wasn't enough that he wrote Sherlock Holmes and Professor Challenger, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Ignatius Conan Doyle, what a name, also put out a pretty respectable volume of weird fiction that stands the test of time even today. We talked about the Ring of Thoth in the last video, so this time we're going to talk about lot number 249, another story about a mummy, predictably so. So in the Victorian era wherein Doyle wrote his stuff, mummies had this sort of weird popularity that made them prime targets for story writing, and their nature of being like a strange mix of being both alive and dead, ancient and mysterious as well as actually human, is why the draw was so strong. Well, one of the many, many reasons that it was so strong. But tons of people ended up writing horror and gothic fiction and weird fiction about mummies, and Doyle is no exception. Here's how this story goes. Oxford doctoral student and athlete Abercrombie Smith lives in one of a set of 3 apartments in this sort of tower, I guess. The other 2 occupied by similarly inclined gentlemen in their studies. Smith's apartment is the top one, followed by Edward Bellingham, and then William Monkhouse Lee on the bottom. Though there also is like a servant gentleman there named Thomas Styles, who kind of like waits on the 3 of them in case they need stuff. So it happens that one day, Smith has his friend Jeffro Hasty over for some hangout times, and Jeffro informs him that if he has not already done so, he probably should not acquaint himself too well with the other 2 in the house, since Bellingham has some sort of, I guess, as unnatural, repulsive quality about him that should drive a man away from his companionship. And then there's Monkhouse Lee as well. He's not the worst guy, but Monkhouse Lee's sister is engaged to Bellingham, and so there's something of a social unit, the 2 of them. But in the interest of not getting tied up in this sort of repellent nature of Bellingham, Smith is advised to leave their acquaintance to be nothing more than just a sort of nod in the hallway as they pass each other. Jeffro then further illuminates his stance by talking about an incident wherein Bellingham sort of pushed this old woman into a pile of mud and made her drop all of her groceries and such. And another gentleman named Long Norton, who was there, took offense to this sort of impropriety, which ended up in a physical fight that resulted in Norton hitting Bellingham with his stick. And now Bellingham's got this like sort of horrible, hateful grudge against Long Norton. They part, and Smith continues in his studies for a while longer into the night. Considering Jeffro's background as a sort of like manly man athlete type, his judgment of Bellingham is probably because he didn't seem manly enough. Smith sort of talks about how if a person can't sort of be measured up by a public school standard of having, you know, good constitution and, knows how to speak Latin or whatever like that, then he's left wanting. But he says something about how Jeffro's perception that someone is wanting of character is often just them wanting breath or circulation or muscle. And kind of calls him out on being discriminatory about it. Truthfully, Smith actually appreciates that Bellingham's light stays on into the night as long as his own did, sometimes even longer, because it shows that another person gives so little of a regard for their amount of sleep that the studies are more important. And, that's respectable to a doctor student, I guess. Anyway, not long later after that, a sudden sort of like strange breathy sound from downstairs caught his attention, followed by a kind of horrible screaming sound, and then only moments after that, the bottom floor tenant, Monkhouse Lee, suddenly rushes up and starts banging on his front door, and is like, hey, help, Bellingham is ill, you have to help, you're the doctor student here, and I can't find a doctor anywhere else, so you're gonna have to do. So the 2 of them rush down to Bellingham's place, and Smith instantly notes, as soon as he steps inside, that this place is covered from floor to ceiling in sort of like Egyptian relics, curios, artifacts and things, including a big taxidermied alligator head, and predictably, because of course, a mummy in its case laid on the table, with various pieces of papyrus sort of scattered nearby the man Bellingham himself, who was passed out cold on the couch. His heart is just going a mile a minute, and it seems like he was scared to catatonia. It takes them a couple minutes, but they manage to sort of revive him and get him back to his senses, and the first thing that he does is spring to his feet and stuff some papyrus from the table into a drawer and then lock it. And then, sort of realizing the direness of his situation, like him passed out next to an open mummy case with a mummy just sort of there laying inside it, and two men having come to save him from what could have been death, he scolds himself for being a fool. He's just, what a fool I am, oh what a fool. And so they stay with Bellingham for a little bit to make sure that he is quite himself again, during which time Bellingham sort of expounds on the coolness and rareness and uniqueness, I guess, of the mummy that's sitting on his table there. There isn't a name for the mummy because the outer sarcophagus was lost, so the only name that he's got is the auction tag that came with it, lot number 249. They finally part, and Bellingham is okay now, and so he and Monkhouse Lee hang out for a little while longer while Smith goes back up to his room. But from that meeting onward, the relationship between Smith and Bellingham grew, sort of much to Smith's chagrin. Bellingham would sort of like call on him relatively often, bring him books that he think would be interesting and just kind of want to hang out and smoke. And he was well learned, despite being the stereotypically like fat, wrinkled, ugly, that's what villains in the Victorian era stories looked like. He would also do villain monologues once in a while, like just, out of the blue. How it must be so crazy to be in control of the forces of life and death, like an angel or a god. And, how Monkhouse Lee is a cool dude, but he doesn't have ambitions like Smith has. Those are straight up villain monologues. That's a trope that we see in plenty of stories after that, but in any case, this should have been suspicious for Smith, but apparently Smith only reads textbooks and has never read a fiction book that has these themes in them that would help him become more genre savvy. But what's more though, Smith could start to hear Bellingham talking to himself like all the time through the floor, and when pressed about it, Bellingham would sort of like nervously and like embarrassedly deny any such practice that he'd been talking to anybody. It must just be your nerves. But then when the manservant Styles offhandedly commented to Smith that there might be something odd about Bellingham, what with all the talking to himself and the strange new habits and all that, Smith started to dismiss him as being nosy. But then there was mention of something shuffling about in Bellingham's room when the door was locked from the outside, and Bellingham himself was away, and that stuck in his memory. This was confirmed to be some sort of secret that Bellingham wanted to keep from everybody when, during one of these visits that Bellingham would take up in Smith's rooms, they both heard the door open downstairs, and then footsteps start to come up the steps toward them. And Bellingham panics and he says, no, I swear I locked that door. It has to have been locked. I'm almost certain that I did it. And he panics and he goes to the front door of Smith's place, opens it, slips out, and slams the door behind him. And then for some time, there's like commotion on the stairs. And then that commotion sort of moves down into Bellingham's room. And then Bellingham, a liar, tries to pass it off as his dog opened the door and like tried to come up after him. But Smith not only knows that he doesn't keep any dogs, but can recognize the difference between a human-sized footprint and a dog-sized foot fall sound on the bloody stairs. So he surmises that Bellingham has to be trying to keep some secret affair, maybe with a woman, which would be scandalous if it were put out into the open and would result in Bellingham being expelled from the college for it. But later that night, Jeffro shows up and has gossip and informs Smith that Long Norton had been attacked by some sort of escaped ape creature, or so they expect, who was tall and had big long nails and dropped from a tree and gouged this guy with his nails. And then Jeffro remarks that this news would be great to Bellingham because, the whole grudge about Long Norton having hit him with a stick because he disagreed about his morals and all that. So that's weird. Smith's mind kind of tries to idly piece this information together for the rest of the night, which distracts him from his studies. And this alone, the fact that he was distracted from his studies and wasn't able to read that night, is enough to convince him to keep to himself for a while and not talk to Bellingham because he ruined his night of reading. But then 10 days later, as he is descending from his room to go out somewhere, Bellingham's door slams open and then out comes Monkhouse Lee. And the two of them are having this big fight or something, and then Lee shouts that the engagement to his sister is very much over. It will absolutely not happen because you are a monster, though I will absolutely keep the promise that I said of not saying anything to anybody. And Bellingham, sort of in true villain style, says, "Oh, you will be sorry." Can we just stop for a second and appreciate that Smith doesn't realize that this guy is a villain yet? Like, two grown-ass men have a big fight, and then one of them leaves and says the engagement is off, and then the other one says, "You'll be sorry about this." That's villain shit! Come on! So anyway, trying to ignore that whole thing, Smith just, like, passes by them on the landing and tries to go to the sporting match where his friend Jeffro is playing. And while watching the sport game or whatever happen, Smith finds that Monkhouse Lee had actually followed him and tries to get his attention. Lee asks him to come back to a little cottage nearby for a cup of tea, maybe some cigarettes, and some information, which he thinks will be pertinent to Smith's life? So Smith follows him back, of course, and Lee comes out straightly to say that Smith needs to move away from the rooms that he keeps as soon as possible, but that he cannot say why, and only can say that Bellingham might be dangerous. And only when pushed does he actually give that information out. And then Smith counters by saying that he knows about the woman that Bellingham keeps, and then Lee counters with an implication that it's definitely not a woman that this secret is about. But without solid evidence of danger, though, Smith cannot be convinced to just up and move from rooms that suit him very well, and so he bids Monkhouse Lee adieu. Lee has moved himself into this cottage to stay away from this villain that now lives there, about which he cannot talk, and bids him the best of luck. It's only now, like, 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the way through the story, this late in the story, that we also get an important piece of information about Smith. And that is that one of the vices he allows himself to have is that he visits a friend of his some distance away down a conveniently dark country road twice a week to hang out and shoot the shit. And it is the day after he met with Monkhouse Lee that he started his journey to his friend's place, when he realized that, repulsive though it may be, he still had one of the books that Bellingham had lent him. And he was struck with the need to return this book to him out of propriety, because while he might have found the man sort of annoying and maybe repellent, it would not do to have something that still belonged to him, because it would feel like he'd stolen it from him. So out of propriety, he goes to return it to him. Bellingham is out when he knocks on the door, but his door is open, which conveniently means that Smith can simply return the book without having to actually interact with him. But when he enters Bellingham's room, he sees that the mummy case is both open and empty, which is curious. Weird, right? But in any case, he puts the book down, and then he shuts Bellingham's door behind him, and then heads down the rest of the stairs in the pitch dark, which is also convenient, whereupon something almost imperceptibly brushes his elbow going past him. And he stops and says, "Hey, who is that?" But then there's no more sound, no more voice or whatever, so he just goes, it's probably my imagination. He exits his building out into the night air, and then immediately he sees someone come running up to him. It is his friend Jeffro, who is both breathless and panicked, and he tells him that Monkhouse Lee has been drowned, and that he needs to come help him regain his life. So hurriedly, Smith is like, "Shit, we need some brandy," and he runs back up to his room to grab his flask of brandy, and then come back down the dark stairs, only to realize that Bellingham's door, which he had closed, is open, and that the mummy is there in the case. And it was not that way moments ago when he saw it. He's shaken by this revelation, but like we have a life to save here. So Smith and Jeffro, who are both athletes, manage to sprint the slightly less than a mile in under 5 minutes, according to the thing, to where Lee was laid on a sofa in his cottage, waterlogged and blue in the face. Smith casts Revivify, or whatever it is that medical people do at Oxford or whatever, and the very much close to dead Lee does finally come back over the period of like 10 minutes. And when he does come back, he panics again. And he tells everyone that no, he did not fall into the river. Something huge picked him up and threw him overhand into the river. He says that he neither saw nor heard anything, but he nevertheless knows exactly what it was. And Smith, sort of cryptically, says that he also knows what it was, and the two share a sort of conspiratorial moment, a locking of eyes, while the other students that are nearby are like, what the hell are you talking about? So Smith and Jeffro walk back to the college together, in basically near silence, contemplating what had just happened. But as Smith goes back to his room, the realization of everything that had transpired in his mind, Bellingham calls out to him from his room and asks if he'd like to come in to tell him about this horrible rumor that something has happened to Lee. Smith emphatically tells him to get fucked, and that Lee is not only alive but doing fantastically, thank you very much, and that he knows Bellingham did it. Or rather, that he and his devil mummy somehow conspired to do it. He accuses Bellingham of being a sorcerer, and says, we don't burn people in England anymore, but we do still keep a hangman, and by God, I will make sure that you are hanged if someone loses life while you are at this college. Bellingham sort of feebly just calls him a lunatic, and says that he has nothing to do with anything, but Smith threatens to make sure that the job is done himself if it comes to it, and then storms back up to his room. The rest of the night he tries to work, but, well, you just watched a near murder basically nearly happen. So the next day, hearing nothing from Bellingham at all, Smith decides to actually go and see the friend that he wanted to see the day before, but was so rudely interrupted by a drowning, and catches Bellingham watching him leave through his window. So, walking down this conveniently dark and long country road, he suddenly becomes aware that there is something gaunt and horrible chasing him. Now, Smith was a famous runner, and it served him well because he hauled his ass down the road away from the shambling, sprinting undead that chased him to the house of his friend Peterson, whose door was mercifully ajar. Here he is, the door slams open, he skids inside, slams the door behind him and locks it, and then just kind of slumps down for a second and is panicking, right? And Peterson shows up and is like, what happened? And he goes, I need brandy. Give me some brandy. Because, of course, in Victorian England, brandy was a medicinal drink in addition to a recreational one. Peterson helps him to regain himself, and then Smith asks to be allowed to sleep there for the night. Ain't no way he's gonna go back to his own quarters when there is something trying to murder him. With a sort of steeled resolve after his recovery, he tells Peterson everything, starting from the first time that he met Bellingham at all, passed out on a couch next to a mummy, to the attack that was perpetrated against Long Norton, to the chase that he just experienced. And while Peterson, of course, questions the claims and tries to suggest some more rational and mundane explanations, it will not stand to do for Smith. So he resolves to write an account of everything that happened, and then have Peterson sign it as a witness with the date on it, so that if he gets arrested for whatever he's gonna do on the next day, he's got an account of everything that happened before he goes to sleep. The next morning, he wakes up pretty early, and then he goes to the gun shop, buys a gun, and borrows a big amputating knife from Jeffro. And so Jeffro and Smith go to Bellingham's apartment, and Jeffro is supposed to wait outside while Smith goes into Bellingham's apartment to try to sort things out, so that in case Smith yells, Jeffro can run in and beat the crap out of him with a big stick or something like that. Smith sort of bursts into Bellingham's apartment, lights a fire in the fireplace, menaces him with the gun, and forces him to cut up the mummy and then burn both it and all of his Egyptian stuff, so that no such black magics can ever be done again by this horrible fat wrinkly man. Bellingham, in disbelief, tries to resist and says like, no, don't do this. You would seriously murder me about this? And Smith replies without hesitation that yes, he would absolutely put a bullet in his ass. Under duress, and without time to sort of do any necromancy that would raise his mummy up to save him, Bellingham is forced to burn all of his materials. So the matter of the reanimating murderous mummy sufficiently addressed in his mind, Smith then leaves, telling Bellingham that if any more mummy shit or Egyptian magic happens nearby, he will know that it's him, and he'll be back, and he will leave with fewer bullets in his gun. Bellingham quits the university and retreats to Sudan, and no one ever hears from him again. And there the tale ends. So, what do we think about it? It's a sort of brazenly open and shut case of reanimation of the mummy, and it's the first actual Victorian mention of a mummy's reanimated state being actually dangerous and malevolent. All of the other Victorian mummies that have been reanimated in stories so far have been shown to either be like mostly normal people, or to be like a pitiable victim creature, rather than this sort of malevolent thing. But it is lot number 249 that really starts the reanimated mummies are dangerous, frenzied, undead killing machines trope that kind of popular culture really loves now to think is just how mummies are in general. But there is a stark difference between this story and, for instance, the earlier work The Ring of Thoth that we talked about already, that other reanimated mummies until this one had retained their intelligence, their humanity, their cognizance. But this one is the first to suggest that there are magics that exist that can cause a mummy to do the bidding of this caster, which results in a mummy robbed of its free will and consciousness and personhood and humanity. Basically, all the modern tropes that put mummies as these mindless things have to trace their heritage back to this story. I mean, think about the way that many young people are exposed to mummies in popular culture. There's movies and things and cartoons and all that, but I'd wager that 9 times out of 10, it's likeliest that they will see them in video games. And I've almost never played a video game that had a mummy in it where the mummy isn't like an enemy or an antagonist or something like that. Like, even in Paper Mario, the mummies are mostly enemy stuff. I'm sure they exist, but in my personal experience, there aren't any. Dare I say that this story was the trope codifier of mummies are dangerous. I mean, look even at like tabletop role-playing games like D&D. Mummies are depicted as, and I'm quoting from the book, raised by dark funerary rituals. A mummy shambles from the shrouded stillness of a time-lost temple or tomb. Having been awoken from its rest, it punishes transgressors with the power of its unholy curse. And even the mummies in D&D that do retain their intelligence through the use of the magics of the most powerful priests and the darkest rituals available are still lawful evil and are crazy dangerous spellcasters with horrible debilitating abilities and even the capability to give you a disease called mummy rot. We don't see mummies as pitiable basically at all anymore. They're not pitiable, they're not victims, they're not relatable, unless they are introduced in like a parody work or some comedy stuff or in like kid literature or kid media. In those cases, things are very different, but that is a topic for another video, which we will get to at some point. I'm thinking that all of these videos are going to get put together and just be like my term paper for this class, but we'll figure it out later. The one in lot 249 isn't quite identical to the image of the sort of intelligent mummy that we see today, where the pharaoh, while still alive, makes the preparations to become a walking undead monster on purpose. Mr. 249 is likely to not have been someone with enough power or money or influence to have had such a thing done, if that thing was even a thing being done at that time. No, the world that 249 creates dictates that the mummy in question was actually just likely a normal person who was forced to remobilize by the dark magics that Bellingham had discovered on those ancient papyruses. Papyri? Papyri? Papyrus! So this calls into question the world of the Egyptians being something of a different one than in the Ring of Thoth, right? Like, this world is one wherein there do exist magics meant to ambulate the dead, but more than that, that they came from Egypt in the first place. This would indicate that simply by virtue of there being scrolls that contain the information needed to magically animate a mummy, it was a practice that was known to the Egyptians as well. And this calls into question the sanctity of the mummification process, in stark contrast to the one in the Ring of Thoth, wherein, according to the story, nobody in their right mind would spoil the grave of their comrade, even with simply opening it up to look for this all-important gem. No, in this version of Egypt, there are at least some dark magics that are intended for the express and explicit purpose of defiling the dead by forcing them to walk again. This is a very clever bit of little world building, wherein the mechanism to raise an Egyptian mummy comes from Egypt and nowhere else. And this is clever from Doyle because it relieves the British from the responsibility of having created dark magic. It can't be the Brits, they're the good guys. If the mechanism by which an Egyptian mummy was raised were something that was scientific or discovered in England, let's say, then the defiling of the dead would be on the hands of the Englishmen who discovered it. Because let's be real, in a Doyle story, it would be a Brit that did it. Heck, in most Victorian things, if it's a cool discovery, it's a Brit that did it. But no, the fact that it comes from the culture of the dead's origin means that England is absolved of any such transgression, absolved of any black magic heritage. They are merely looking at the transgressions of the ancient world, and it's only by happenstance that they can replicate it themselves using these ancient languages and dead rituals. And this keeps England squarely in the space of the virtuous, the everlasting empire that can't possibly fall because they've learned from their predecessors. They have done no wrong ever. And even if the sorcerer in this story was himself an Englishman, we see that he defects off to Sudan as soon as his malintended deeds are stopped. He is, as a logical fallacy might malappropriate, no true Englishman. What about the idea that the mummy is like used as a weapon meant for killing? This can sort of tap into some of the ideas that were prevalent in the Victorian era, that it is not those of learning and virtue that do misdeeds, but rather those of darker skin or more sunny heritage that do so, possibly even just those of a lower class. I mean, Lovecraft basically deals with this on a comic level, when, like, if you read his stories, it's noted that basically any bad thing that happens in any of the narratives is attributed to either horrible, unknowable creatures or to minorities and lower class people. It can be observed that it's not Bellingham, the upstanding scholarly white man, that's doing the attacks. No, it is the debased, gigantic, gaunt, grotesque Egyptian dead that is the real criminal. Monkhouse Lee even remarks that the mummy might have been that caste of human that was a slave that helped to build the pyramids after scrutinizing its, quote, crooked, unclean talons. Which handily brings us to the direct addressment of the sort of evil is ugly, ugly is evil trope here. I mean, Bellingham is constantly depicted as being like fat, wrinkled, ugly, repulsive. It's no wonder that the first few paragraphs of the story, like, we don't already know exactly who the villain is. Of course we do. It's the ugly one. We've got, okay, Smith, who's the doctoral student who is also an athlete, who is fit and healthy and like a famous runner. And then there's Lee, who is labeled the skinny one, which sort of leans away from ugly, but also away from hero, because all heroes have to be picturesque, but he's not ugly. And then there's Jeffro, who's like a sort of great, brutish athlete, and is said to be basically a meathead because his desire for gossip and sport make him seem discriminatory against those who are less muscly than him. Still not ugly. But then there's Bellingham, the damnable, the reptilian, the one whose face makes people's gorge rise. The one that's clearly the villain if we are adhering to the classic tropes. It's so pervasive of his character that his repellent appearance is something to which one might have to grow accustomed, and is only barely balanced out by his charm and wit. Smith has to take matters into his own hands, because factually, nobody's gonna believe him if he says that Bellingham is using sorcery to make his mummy rise up and walk and try to kill his enemies. I mean, yes, it's vigilantism at best, but there is a justice in it too. Lacking support from higher institutions like the police or the college, one man has to save the world alone. It's of course kind of proudly patriotic too, in a local sense, if not a countryman's sense. I mean, Smith says that if any man at the college were to lose his life, he would have Bellingham hanged. And that's loyalty to the institution closest to him, the institution that is backed by the British government, of course. We do also see that Smith is singularly English because he remarks on his national hatred of making a scene. And it sort of shows how much of the Victorian English culture he was steeped in, right? No, Smith is the epitome of the English gentleman. That is, until the tables turn. Up until a very specific point in the story, Smith is a man of science. He's a man of reason who has nothing but contempt for things supernatural in nature, right? When he's discussing with Jeffro the attack on Long Norton, he even interjects, "What then, have we come down to spooks?" And then I assume he picks up his teacup and has his little finger up while he drinks it. The text describes his words as scientific contempt. His rationality is what makes him a strong man of letters, a great doctoral student. So when he discovers the mummy back in his so recently empty case, and all the pieces begin to sort of fall together in his brain for him, a change befalls him. Now, instead of the rational, science-minded English gentleman, Smith becomes a conspiracist, possessed of a weakened or fanciful mind, accused of drawing patterns where ordinary rational explanations could suffice to make sense of each event individually. But humans are good at one thing, and that is recognizing patterns. As Lovecraft's Francis Wayland Thurston remarks at the beginning of the famous story The Call of Cthulhu, the most merciful thing in the world is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We can certainly correlate enough to get ourselves in trouble, though, and that is exactly what Smith sort of accidentally does. He goes from someone who does not believe what his servant is telling him to someone whose testimony is not believed by someone of a higher status than his. The irony is not lost here. This is a sort of inversion of positions, and it's a pretty common aspect of Gothic horror, and especially in weird fiction. In fact, it's this very archetype that gets used a lot, like suspiciously so. Man of science doubts the supernatural, then experiences it, and then is doubted by others. We also see reference to a ton of other common tropes now, well, common now, but groundbreaking back then, I'm sure. When the mummy itself is destroyed, that would theoretically be enough to stop the present menace, but at the very least, Smith is genre savvy enough to destroy the papyrus that ostensibly had the spell written on it in the first place. And that points to the idea that gets toyed around with in so many more properties from that point on, like Indiana Jones, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, where these sort of artifacts might be collected somewhere, either for protection against use or for personal use for like a villain or something. I mean, think about the sheer amount of Egyptian stuff that Bellingham has in his place. If just one piece of it was able to produce world-affecting magic like raising the dead, how much more is there that has similar effects? Why did he go back to Sudan? Is he a possible recurring villain in a pulp fiction series based on Smith having known about this now, gathering a team of other gothic horror protagonists to protect the world from menaces like the Mummy and its master. Yeah, I think I would so be the one who writes that series. Are you guys interested in reading a series like that one? This script could turn into a term paper by itself. It's already just short of 4,000 words and will likely be pretty long of a video. So we're gonna leave more discussion of like mummy tropes and themes for the next couple stories that we talk about. Trust me, there will be stories about other topics that are not just mummies, I promise. But currently, it's convenient for me to do these ones that talk about mummies and things because they pertain directly to the class that I'm taking and will help me on my way to writing term papers. So get used to the idea for at least a little while. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe if you are not already. Statistically, if I tell you to do it, you are more likely to do it. So click that subscribe button if you please. I would also like to point your attention to the like and share options that you could do. If you think that someone, one of your friends or whatever, would like this, post the link to them. Post the link on your Facebook or your Twitter or something. I would love to get more people watching my stuff because how cool would that be? I have a Patreon that is mostly D&D focused, but if you like this stuff, supporting me there will also be supportive. The next story that we're talking about is probably going to be Jewel of the Seven Stars by Bram Stoker, which Stoker's my jam, so let's do it. It's gonna be a longer story, so we're probably gonna have to put it into like a series, but we'll see. Thank you guys again so much for coming, and I will see you next time.